Welcome to the Poetic Resurrection Podcast, where we explore perceptions. How self-reflecting questions can give you a better understanding of self. I'm your host, Sonia Iris Lozada. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Poetic Resurrection. Today, we have Thierry Kehou. He is a founding member of Lampblack, a magazine and literary organization. He is a translator and director of programs and partnerships for poets and writers. Welcome.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
My mind is going what can I ask him? I want to ask you about publishing. I want to ask you about how you became a translator. I want to ask more about Lampblack. Where would you like to start?
Oh man, there's so many places to start. I guess we can start with sort of literary nonprofit world that I find myself spending a considerable amount of my time these days as the director of programs and partnerships at Poets and Writers. Been there since November. Previously, I was at the Center for Fiction, a literary nonprofit based in Brooklyn, managing programs there. I sort of ended up in this field after my MFA, looking for opportunities where I could stay connected to the literary world. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes for many people that, if they've gotten their MFA or if they're interested in sort of staying connected to the literary world while they're writing, it's either working in publishing, working for a literary magazine or a literary nonprofit. I ended up in the literary nonprofit world. An opportunity opened up in Brooklyn, where I lived after moving back from New Jersey for my MFA. And I started working at the center back in 2019. I was there for about 3 years, and then after that moved on to Poets and Writers. But it's been an opportunity to stay connected to the literary world, but also to continue learning. One of the things you don't learn a lot about while you're pursuing your MFA, or if you don't even have that privilege of going for an MFA, if you're just sort of learning about the publishing world as you go, is, you don't really know what it's like to, what that other side is like, what the publishing world is like, what the literary world is like. It's been 4 years of sort of gaining access and having a clear understanding of what the editor's work life looks like, and how that impacts the writer. What the agent's work life looks like and how that impacts the writer. So being able to make those connections as a writer who one day hopefully will have an agent, will have an editor, will have a publisher, knowing how things work on that end, who might be written about in a magazine. So, sort of learning those relationships between the writer and those other very sort of crucial pieces of the literary ecosystem. It's been invaluable, and like I said, it's something that, it's information that's sort of hard to come by, but I've had 4 more years of education working in the literary nonprofit world, and it's been wonderful.
Yeah, because I took that course, it was Publishing 101 with Poets and Writers.
Yes, how to get your writing published, which is now Mapping the Maze. We launched the 2nd edition, just ended this week. It's called now Mapping the Maze. You actually have an official name now. But yes, I remember you being in that.
Yeah, was it the same? Is it the same thing that repeated, or?
Same thing that repeated, yeah. It's just that now we finally actually have we've branded it with a name. So it's called Mapping the Maze. Yeah.
No, that was super informative. I had no idea because I self-publish. I'm the kind of person, I have to write it and I have to get it out there. I just have to get it out there. Like writing one thing and then they say, well, it's going to take 3 to 6 months to get back to you. I'm like, no, I could get that out now. And I know that self-publishing has a bad rap because so many people just throw things out there that are really not good quality. But there's a lot of also, I find, self-publishing who are just people that hire an editor and hire a book. You job everything out. You don't do everything yourself because of that. And those I find that are better quality. But yeah, I think that going sometimes through an actual publisher, it is more polished.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, there definitely, if you don't want to wait, then self-publish. The thing with the writing is no one is actually really waiting, unless you've signed a contract, and at that point, someone is actually waiting for your manuscript, but no one is, until you've signed a contract, no one is waiting for that thing that you're working on. I think the great thing about self-publishing is if, just allows you to get your work out there on your own terms. And I think that's important, to be able to do things on your own terms. And there are also advantages of, going through a publisher. They definitely have, obviously the brand, and to sort of put behind an author or a title, but they also just have the resources to push a work out there, to get it on the shelves, to get it in front of the, critics who will be reviewing it too. They're able to do things that can raise platform for a book and for an author. So those things are, not to be sort of counted out. But, you can also self-publish. And if you have the funds to be at minimum, obviously get, someone to look over your work, like a developmental editor, to, make sure that what you're putting out there is readable, and it
because I hire people. I know that I polish it as much as I can, and then I give it to them.
Yeah.
And it goes back and forth after that.
And with social media as well, that's another avenue that gives people who are publishing independently to make a name for themselves. It's not even what it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Social media, you can really you can promote yourself out there, in a way that you couldn't before, beyond just having a website. It's just having followers on social media. And, it's a very useful tool, which I don't use, but, I've definitely seen writers.
I use it. And I, for people that are out there and self-publish, I just, instead of being on top of it all the time, trying to get social media out, I just pay for an ad,
Yeah.
Have them do the work for me. And you could do it pretty inexpensively.
Yeah.
Because I think some people that are writers are afraid to approach publishing companies, are afraid to get out there, because I find that many writers are kind of like introverts. So for them to get out there and do things, it's more difficult than someone that's already outgoing.
Definitely. Yeah.
So if someone was new, let's say new writer, they have a book, they're pretty proud of it, what is the first steps they should do?
It's a good question. I think there are a lot of different directions I think you can take. It's always hard to tell when something is actually done, but you definitely want to make sure that, you've had enough eyes on it before you start really sending it out. So I think having trusted readers, I think that's very important. Having people you can rely on, really, because it's a big ask. So, definitely having people in your corner who you have a relationship with, you've been sort of going back and forth, editing each other's work maybe, but someone to have another eye on your work, I think, is important. And, and I think once it's ready, you want to start, and maybe even before it's quote unquote ready, but you definitely want to start maybe approaching agents, or even before then, or simultaneously, maybe before then, but start looking into contests. There are lots of contests out there that allow you to, if you're writing a novel, for example, maybe submit an excerpt, because editors and agents, they look at those things. They look at, who's won a contest, or who's, maybe even was a finalist, or, because sometimes even if you're not the winner, they will publish maybe, the top 5, people, they'll publish their work. And a lot of editors and agents, they keep track of those things, because you may not be the winner, but maybe you came in, you were a runner-up, or you were just an honorable mention. But writing is so, everyone has a different taste, so something that may have come in third place might be an editor's or an agent's, flavor. They might be like, "Ooh, I actually like that one as well," or I like that better than even the actual story that won first place or whatnot. So I think getting your work out there helps. I would even say before you even lock in a contract or get an agent, because those things help, when you're pitching a book, to say, you had your work published here, it won this contest, or I did this residency, I got this prize, I got this fellowship. Those are things that, you can put in your pitch letter, to say that I won such and such prize, I had this fellowship at such and such residency. Because it shows that someone else has put a stamp on your work, a stamp of approval.
Mm-hmm.
The further up you go, the more of an investment. For example, an agent is going to put in your work, publisher is going to put in your work. So if someone else has said is worth my time, whether it's a magazine or a small prize or a contest, it signals to an editor, or if you're going the sort of small press route, you don't necessarily always need an agent, but also it signals to the agent that other people who I respect, other publications, editors at these publications have put a stamp of approval, so it's worth taking a look at or maybe taking a stab at. So yeah, getting your word out there, doing readings. You never know who's in the audience, who's listening to you read a story that may not have even been published. So finding different ways of getting your work out there, whether it's through readings, whether it's through publications, that helps. But you can also just submit it, and without having done any of those things. And people do get agents without having had their work out there. That's doable. Yeah, I would say those are routes that I would recommend.
I find certain writers don't fit in a category.
Yeah.
It's more difficult for them to get published. It's like, where do we put you? This is like self-help sci-fi. I mean, where do we put you? I find that BIPOC people have more that problem. Same thing happened with me with acting. When I first started acting, nobody knew where to put me. Yeah. So what do you say to something like that? Do you find a press that's more sensitive to what you do?
I think you do. I think it's, ultimately, I think the reason why we're looking for publishers to have the book ultimately sold, to have the book ultimately land on the shelf. So I think it's important to know where in bookstores, where your work fits. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately your work is going to be marketed, salespeople who we often don't talk a lot about in the publishing world, but there are people out there who don't work in offices. They're making calls, sending emails, going door to door to bookstores, selling your book in the store, putting and finding a place for your book on a shelf. So I think it's important to know where you fit in the marketplace, because it is ultimately a marketplace. It's a business. Whether it's what genre do you fit in, who are other comparable writers out there. Because we, at a certain point, we do fit somewhere for sales and marketing purposes. That's just the formula, the rubrics that they use. So it's important to also know that that's a thing. So let me get that ironed out first. Is this a memoir? Is this an autobiography? Is this a hybrid text? Is it literary fiction? Is it genre fiction? Like what exactly? And then what is this about? In one sentence.
Your log line.
Exactly. You have to know that's what they're ultimately going to use to sell your book. Once you figure that out, you can reject it all, and then, and find, because it's there are lots of works out there that fit in multiple categories, and who wants to be pigeonholed? So, you can write something that also fits into 4 other boxes, but I think it's important to know that box that is ultimately going to help you get your work on the shelf.
You're right.
Where I think writers want to end up. And same thing goes with, literary magazine is, what it's important to be knowledgeable of different magazines, or where have some of the, stories or poems or writers that I really like, where have they been a great fit? Because if their work resonates with me or it feels like very comparable to my work, that might be a place for me to start. So fit is important, and knowing your fit it's key. But then once you figure that out, like I said, you've done that homework. You can reject it all or dismantle it, and once you've made a name for yourself, I think maybe sometimes that stuff doesn't matter as much, but definitely I think when you're getting started, it's important to identify, like you said, make sure you've got your log line. Where is this first book? Because you only get to do it once that first time. That debut is coming out. You only get to be a debut author once. So I think it's important to get it right. And if you're successful, even not successful, but once you've mastered that, I think it makes it easier, I would think. I'm not speaking from experience, but I would.
I actually know I'm doing a workshop. One of the writers there who came to speak, he wrote, if I remember it correctly, like a sci-fi thriller kind of thing. but they put it into a different category because it could fit there. And he became a bestseller because they marketed it to an area that is not that doesn't have that many people.
Like popular?
Yeah, it's not like, general sci-fi that you could get lost in that. So they got more specific about it, and it's a good book. He's well known for that. I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's the categories.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got a little bit. Anything you want to add more about publishing?
No, not really. It's there are a lot of great resources out there about learning about publishing. Obviously, Poets and Writers Magazine is a great resource, and there's a recent article in the New York Times Magazine. I'm drawing a blank on the title, but it's very recent. Lisa Lucas was the publisher of, I think, Pantheon, was featured in it. But yeah, there's been a lot written about sort of about publishing, the state of publishing, especially as it pertains to publishing writers of color, publishing writers who have been underpublished. I definitely recommend reading those articles. This article in the New York Times Magazine that featured Lisa Lucas was a good read. So
I want to switch over and find out how you became a translator.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I think, story. I like to say I've been translating my whole life. I grew up bilingual. French and English were, and my parents' native Fefe were sort of languages that were spoken in the home. So when you hear multiple languages, you're from a young age, I think you're constantly translating in your head, trying to figure out, well, what does that mean in this language? It's a fun exercise. But as far as literary translation is concerned, I came to it about about 10 years ago. Actually, a bit before then. I did in undergrad. I did take a class in translation. It was more sort of applied translation, sort of like business or medicine or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I had the opportunity my senior year of college many years ago to do some translation work for. It was part research, part translation. It was mostly translation for Professor Robin Kelley, who was writing the autobiography of Thelonious Monk. He needed a whole bunch of text to be translated from French into English. And I had a friend at the time who was also doing some research for him, and she told me about this opportunity. And I thought, sure, I think I can handle this. And that wasn't really literary translation. It was primarily translation for the sake of making sure that these research materials for him were translated into English. So that was my first foray, I think, in translation, was translating somewhere between 150 and 20 words for Dr. Kelley. And then many years later, I was in Cameroon, where my family's from, visiting, working at a school there. Coming out of the school one day, and I stopped by this vendor, this man who had a stand outside of the school, and he sold materials for school, pens and pencils and notebooks, and he also sold books. I had no idea that he sold books. I never noticed the books, but when I was close to the stand, I saw he had books. I think up until that point, I had only read one book by a Cameroonian author, so I was like, this is an opportunity for me to read. And that book was in English, but to read more books by Cameroonian authors. And so that day, there were two books on the table that jumped out at me. And one of those books was by a writer named Francis Bebey. The name was familiar to me. Francis is a very well-known, or he was, he's no longer, a well-known musician, really prolific musician, but he also happened to be a writer, which I had no idea. I grew up knowing about Francis as a musician, but had no idea he was a writer, so I was really curious. The book was called Trois Petits Cireurs, which translated in English into Three Little Shoeshiners. It was a really short book, about 60 pages. I'd only brought one book with me on that trip. It was going to be 3 months, so I thought to myself, I needed more books. And so I got these two books, and I went home that night and I read Francis's book. think I read it in 2 nights. My first reaction was, this needs to be a play. That was my initial reaction after reading the book, because it has a very sort of Baroquean feel. It's a book, it's sort of set into 5 really small chapters, so very Baroquean, sort of similar to the 5-act plays and Baroque theater. So that was my first reaction, this needs to be a play. And then I kept thinking, like, well, this also needs to be able to be read in English. Like, this needs to be in English. And I wasn't even necessarily thinking about literary translation. To me, it was like, this book needs to appear in English. And I wasn't thinking about literary translation because that's not even a term for me that existed, like literary translation. I had read lots of translated literature, obviously, growing up at school. No one really talks about translators, so when you read a book in translation, for example, if you read a Russian author, in English, or if you read a Mexican author in English, or a Spanish author, a German author, one of those classical texts, when you read those books in school, you know the author, the original author, the author who wrote in the original language, but never, at least not in my experience, I remember ever a teacher being like, this book was translated by, because it's not something that, it's not a way that texts are introduced by teachers, and it's also not a way that even the publishing world looks at translation. So translators are rarely featured on the cover of books, translated by that. And that's starting to change a lot. There's been a lot of movement there. But, if you go back 50 years or 30 years, that wasn't the case. Anyway, all that to say is that I wasn't thinking about literary translation, just that this book needs to be in English. I would love for people who don't speak French to be able to read this in English. And so I started translating the book, about a year later, and I found myself really enjoying what I was doing. But, I think one of the sort of driving factors for me in translation was, or like my purpose there is really the purpose that I was in Cameroon to begin with, which was really I'd had this burning question for many years growing up, which was, what was it like for my parents growing up in Cameroon? In reading these texts, so, I read a lot. I've read since then lots of books written by Cameroonian authors. And in that book by Bebey, I was like learning a lot about what it was like, it's a fiction, it's obvious, it's fiction, but, good fiction reads like nonfiction,
Yes.
And so the book was painting a picture for me that answering things that I'd wanted answers for a long time, and I could not get from my parents. And so for me, really, translation, and I focus a lot on Francophone African writers, but, I'm obviously very invested in translating works by Cameroonian writers, because I ultimately want to translate books and those books to be published so that people who are growing up in the United States and who, have similar backgrounds that I do, so, parents are from a French-speaking background, maybe Francophone Africa, they want to learn a little bit about where their parents are from, or this place that is in many ways a part of who they are, but they may not have access to it in English. So I see myself as a bridge, to sort of making that happen. And I think there's opportunity for many different populations to make that happen, in this country. This is a country of immigrants, and I think there's opportunities for young people of all ages, really, to dive into translation and to take on translation as a means to bringing into English works that say something about, sort of where they're from. And I think writers do it in a way that, film or television can't do it. There's something about fiction or poetry. It captures something that, film can't do.
It captures the flavor of the culture, because my heritage is Puerto Rican. So I have a lot of books in Spanish. I'm not a translator, but I read them in Spanish because they show the history of the culture. And so, yeah, it is good to be, and translation is a major skill. You have to capture the essence of that writer in the translation.
You do, and it's a lot of fun. One of the things I've had to learn is I need to, when I'm working on a specific author, for example, Bebey, I had to read his other books, just to really and his style is pretty consistent, I would say, throughout, his works. But it's, so it's like I had to read multiple books to really get the essence of his tone and his style and his humor and his wit, because it really is sort of like I feel like I'm constantly in conversation with him when I'm writing, and like I said, he's no longer, so I don't have access to him, but that's helped me a lot, which is reading as many of his works that I can, just to really get a sense of, his tone. And it's difficult, but it's a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, and it's made me also just a sharper writer of English, just having to be really sort of selective of words that I choose to use to represent a specific feeling, or just to represent a specific thing in French. Like, how do I translate that into English? So it's made me really, I'd say it's definitely improved my vocabulary, and I'm an English speaker, but it really does make you focus on getting the word down right. Sometimes there are multiple words that can express something, and you have to land on one word. It's a challenge, but it's a lot of fun. So I use a dictionary a lot, but it's also made me just more aware about, structure when it comes to fiction, and pacing and tone, and, all the different sort of elements of a work of fiction. It's really made me more aware of those things. And a lot of fiction writers actually used to be, to be a fiction writer and a translator at the same time, it's from what I've learned, it's something that was very common. It was pretty common for writers to also translate. And to me it makes sense now, because I see why why writers would do that. It's because it does in many ways make you, because when you're writing your own fiction, it's like you're really you're into your own work. It's like that's why you need editors. That's why you need someone to take a look and make sure that, what you're doing, that you're not sort of losing the reader. So obviously when you're translating, you're reading something that's a finished product, you're translating something that's a finished product. I would say in many ways you're kind of rewriting it. But so it does allow you to see what a finished product looks like and to work from that.
We're segueing into Lampblack. What is
Sure.
Lampblack, and how does that work with like what you do as a translator, what you do as a writer? How does that work together?
Lampblack it's a literary nonprofit. Happy to say we just got our 501c3 status about a couple months ago, so that was really exciting. But Lampblack is the product of numerous conversations between me and a few other folks, a group of folks. We started out as about 21 writers. So it came together to start this organization that is committed to the advancement of Black literature. So what we do is we publish a magazine every year. We've published one magazine that came out last year. Our founders issue of Lampblack came out for last year. It's available on our website still, I believe. And we have another issue coming out this year in October as well. So we publish a literary magazine featuring Black writers, nonfiction, fiction, translation, poetry. So we publish it all. And we also have a literary program. So we have a Inky Bulb, which is is that on Facebook or TikTok? I think it's on TikTok. So one of our Lampblack members is interviewing a bookstagrammer. So, and we're just, they talk about various topics, and we also have, I believe this one is on Facebook. It's like a writer interview series. So one of our Lampblack members interviews a writer. We exist because, we recognize that there's a lot of work that needs to be done out there to promote Black literature. To us, it just seemed like it was a no-brainer, and I think, obviously the times were right. We got started sort of in late 2019, and 2020 came around, and we all know what happened then. And there's been an explosion in every sector, making sure that there not just representation, but I would say accurate representation, making sure that the people doing the work are, sort of reflect the people that they are also trying to put an emphasis on or to highlight. So we solely publish works by Black authors. Yeah, it's been an exciting endeavor, and we're growing. I think having this, nonprofit status now is going to allow us to raise some funds. We're really, really excited to relaunch also new programs in the years to come. So,
do you have Black authors international or just U.S.?
Yeah, international. So, good point. Like we're global. We have members in various parts of the world as well. Korea, South Africa, obviously in the U.S. In our next issue, we'll be featuring writers, I believe, from definitely not just the U.S. I can say that.
Okay.
Definitely.
So it is an international organization.
It's international, and I would say, Black is sort of global. If you're doing it, yeah, I can't imagine it doing it any other way, especially in literature. There's the opportunity for sort of having, the Black experience. Definitely, it's a global story.
It really is. And you can see the nuances of how each culture advanced.
Yeah.
I studied music, and much of the Black experience from Africa, the communication was the drums. And until people caught up with that, and like, oh no, you can't have the drums. That was a way of organizing each other, But yeah, no, I think that that's a beautiful thing to do. And also it introduces people that wouldn't normally read that. Like I was reading something the other day, and it was about the hard times that they grew up with, but yet it was done in a light way, because sometimes if you come across too heavy, someone of a different culture isn't going to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
It came across a light way, but wow, I mean, the experiences of growing up in a tough neighborhood, I mean, I could relate to somewhat of that because I grew up in a tough neighborhood myself. To see the different, I mean, this could be a neighborhood that's right next door to somebody, and the experiences are totally different.
Yeah.
So I think that something like that is a good thing to have. I think it introduces many people to what is actually out there, but the true experience of it, not what people think it is. Because I find that is what they think it is versus what it actually is.
Yeah, I like to think that our, Lampblack is, there's a conversation happening within the magazine. And I think there is, I would say typically in any literary publication, there's a conversation because every author every text is different, but there's there's definitely it's been an opportunity for us to have that sort of global conversation between, Black writers, and then for you to have that experience of reading it and also sort of coming away, feeling like you've learned a little bit you've learned obviously about another writer. We definitely were really excited about featuring up and coming writers, from the diaspora. So yeah, it's been, like I said, we have a few writers in our next issue who are based on the continent, based in Europe, obviously based in the US. It's fun. It's exciting. And
it's good to get the different aspects of experience, because we're like all over the place. You could have been raised poor or wealthy, or I met, and he was my professor at UCLA, and he was a drummer, and drumming to certain cultures in Africa is royalty. So he came from it was really nice to see the different variety, because we're not introduced to that often. Now I want to know about you. You're writing a novel.
Yeah, I'm also writing a novel. When I have the time to get back to it, here and there, I'm writing a novel about. I don't want to talk too much about it, but
is it fiction?
It's fiction. Yeah, it's a fictional novel. Take place in 1970s Harlem, and it's about the relationship between a young man from Cameroon and his Black roommate.
There's actually a cultural shock there.
Oh no, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's cultural shock, but there's also I'm really, my parents came to the U.S. in the 70s in New York, and so I've always sort of been fascinated about that first encounter, and it's not a story that I have that I know too much about, outside of reading about similar encounters in other fiction or nonfiction. But I've always sort of been fascinated and curious about what those first encounters were like, especially because the 70s, especially in Harlem, were, some interesting times politically, economically, ripe for a lot of tension, but also a lot of opportunity for building solidarity between people who look the same but are, in terms of the relationships to this country, are poles apart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always been, someone who was obviously born here and sort of being quote unquote African American, but was raised, with not that, that legacy, that I think a lot of people of color have in this country, which is brutal. Mm-hmm. And I think, on my parents' side, there's another legacy that was, also you could say somewhat brutal. But, it's a way for me to sort of address that as well at the Gap, but also of the possibilities for learning about each other, but also just solidarity and figuring out how we got to this point. So my novel sort of gets into that, deals with some larger topics as well, which I won't go into too much.
We don't want to give away the plot.
No, it's not even so much the plot, but I don't want to get, like you said, it's not a political podcast, so I don't want to get into politics and talking about big issues, but that to me is I think at the heart of this novel. It's about masculinity and the relationship between immigrants in the 70s, which I think the large majority, they started sort of coming in the 60s and 70s. So sort of post-independence, but also, at a time like the 70s in New York and Harlem where there was a lot happening.
I don't know why I flashed the Harlem Renaissance, but I think the Harlem Renaissance was at that time or earlier?
Yeah, no, it was, I think it started slightly earlier, but obviously, there was the Harlem Renaissance. This is sort of post-civil rights movement, but there was also, the sort of drug epidemics in Harlem, and politically, just I think there's also a lot of beauty, in the 70s, Harlem and New York City, and this book takes place in the jazz club, Harlem in the 70s, primarily in the coat check room of a jazz club where the protagonist works. So, yeah, so jazz is also, or that space, that music and jazz and that space is important to this novel.
Is there anything, which I'm really looking forward to reading that, is there anything you would like to say to the audience that you feel they should know, either about publishing or about Lampblack or about writing?
Yeah, I would say, Poets and Writers are going to be launching 2 more editions of Mapping the Maze in the fall, so one in September and one in November, if I wasn't clear about this. But Mapping the Maze is it's a workshop that helps writers understand the publishing process and chart their path to publication. So the workshop, we invite agents, book editors, literary magazine editors, and writers to talk to participants about the publishing process. From each obviously has their own angle, and it's usually a 3 or 4 day workshop. We've been experimenting with the format, but so we'll be launching those again in the fall. 2 more editions. So there's a space on our website. If you sign up for our newsletter, you can sort of stay informed about when we release the dates for that. As far as Lampblack is concerned, like I said, our next issue will come out in, I believe, late September. So definitely recommend you check that out. We're at lampblacklit.com. Please check us out. Like us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow us there if you'd like. And then as far as me personally, I have a book coming out in translation next year. It's Jean d'Amérique, a Haitian playwright, poet, but his debut novel came out in March of this year, and I've translated that for other press, so that'll be coming out in the spring of next year. Don't have a title for it yet, but you should check him out if you read French. His name is Jean d'Amérique, John of America, if you want to translate it later. Yeah, he's a brilliant writer. The book in French is called Soleil, Coudre, so a sun to be stitched or sewn. It's a very beautiful book, very poetic. Obviously, he's a poet, but the book is beautiful. His language is beautiful. I won't say too much about the book, but yeah, it's coming out in translation next year with other press. So was really excited to work on that project. Other projects are forthcoming as well.
For people out there, I actually took the course Mapping the Maze, which is now the name of it, and it was super informative. And if you have the opportunity to take the course, I would definitely suggest it. It was extremely helpful for me. And I wanted to thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to speak. Pleasure talking to you.
I took the course and I was very impressed. So I'm like, I got to get him on the podcast. So thank you, everyone out there. Sign up for Poets and Writers and follow Thierry Kehou. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Poetic Resurrection podcast, available on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, and many other podcast platforms. Please visit us and subscribe to our newsletter at poeticresurrection.com for the latest information and updates.